Peter. There we go. It's a very nice American voice joining us there to tell us we're being recorded. This is the moment that if you don't want to be recorded, you only have one option, which is to leave, which is a bit dramatic. But we record the meeting to help Helen write the minutes. So it is important. So I hope you'll bear with us. Today's meeting will follow some tried and trusted format. You may recall that Natural Cambridgeshire has identified 6 priority landscapes where it wants to double nature. And we're talking about those in turn at these forums. Today, we're going to be talking about the John Clare Countryside. And as I've hinted, I'm going to go into a different mode and talk about that with my friend and colleague, Justin Tilley. We then focus on climate change and biodiversity. And I'm delighted that we've got Marcus Nyman and Daniel Zeitner, MP, as our speakers in that session. And we then look at the role of the natural environment in economic decision making. And we have 3 speakers there, Matthew Agarwala, Adrian Cannard, and John Shropshire. And at the end of that, Helen will give you a review of the overall work of Natural Cambridgeshire. And then I'm delighted that Councillor Steve Tierney is joining us from Fenland District Council to give a concluding summary. And we will finish at 12 o'clock as agreed. As ever, do use the chat. We found the chat room a very good way of managing your input. I try and keep an eye on it as much as I can and reflect on it. And the chat is also recorded and captured and used to help us take things forward after each meeting. Great. I think we've got a fair audience. We've got 65 people here now. Can I just check, because I can't see you. Justin, are you here?
I'm here, Richard.
There you are. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to start off by taking my Natural Cambridgeshire hat off and putting my Langdyke Countryside Trust hat on. I'm also chairman of the Langdyke Countryside Trust, a charity that operates in the interest of nature recovery and local people's interest in the natural environment in the area north and west of Peterborough. And I'm going to share my screen and give a few slides about where we are with the concept of the John Clare Countryside as a nature recovery programme and the work we've been doing to engage local people in that project. And Justin will reflect at the end of that on where the project sits in the sort of policy framework and the logical next steps in his capacity as the at Natural England. And Justin, I've forgotten your current job title, so you're going to have to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Richard. It is a bit of a moving piece.
You want to do that now, so people are at least aware of who you are, Justin?
Right,
I always say Justin is also part of the Langdyke Trust, so I know him much better in that sense.
So thanks, Richard. Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Justin Tilley. I'm currently a manager within the West Anglia team of Natural England. So that covers counties of Beds, Cambs, Northants, Essex and Herts. I've also got particular interest, particularly with National Nature Reserve work and the Nature Recovery Network agenda. So I've been covering various roles with regard to those particular elements in recent times, and I think that plays quite nicely with the idea of this sort of place-based opportunities within Cambridgeshire.
Lovely, thanks, Justin. And as ever, I will move at pace just to keep us on time, but there will be time for some questions at the end. Okay, so I'm going to share a screen and talk a little bit about the John Clare Countryside project. I'm going to need somebody to give me a big sort of shout and say, yes, it's for Helen. Is that working? It is.
Yes.
Great. I'm going to keep it in this format because it helps me to sort of work through it. John Clare Countryside is a concept that's been around for probably the best part of 15 years. It is a desire expressed primarily by local people and residents to create a heritage landscape with nature at its heart in the countryside north and west of Peterborough. I'll show you a map in a minute of exactly where it is. You may well wonder, why is it called the John Clare Countryside? I hope you know that John Clare is, of course, our most significant national poet of nature, no doubt about that. I won't hear anything other. He was born just down the road from where I'm speaking now in Helpston, and he wrote extensively and beautifully great poetry about the natural environment in his area, and of course is well known for the poems around the damage to the countryside of the coming of the railways and the enclosure movement. I actually see Clare as primarily a naturalist and then a poet, but either way, he is a significant, I'd say, iconic figure in our natural world, and someone that we in this area see as an inspiration for what we're trying to do. And that's why it's called the John Clare Countryside. The Langdyke Countryside Trust, which I chair, was set up in 1999 with Clare in mind and with a single aim about how we preserve and enhance the natural world in the villages west and north of Peterborough. And it's been going now, as you can see, for 22 years. It runs 7 nature reserves on Peterborough's doorstep, and there's a list there. For those of you who are Clare aficionados, Swadywell Pit is perhaps the most significant. He wrote 2 poems particularly about the pit and its wonderful wildlife. But Langdyke is one of those examples of I think, where a lot of the future of natural recovery lies. It is locally led. It has, I think we're at 198 household memberships, the vast majority of which live in the John Clare Countryside, in the villages here. And it really is all about local people taking action to preserve and protect their countryside, their environment. The majority of people who are members would not know a garden warbler from a blackcap. They would probably struggle to tell a frog from a toad, but they love their local countryside and are absolutely committed to its future. And one of the roles of Langdyke is to help them with some of those identification issues. But you know what? They just take joy in the wildlife and the nature all around them. John Clare Countryside, basically here is a map. Over on the right-hand side is urban Peterborough. To the north, we have the River Welland, and to the south, the River Nyman, and then we have this rather artificial barrier of the A1 on the western side. It is already an area of significant natural importance. It contains 2 national nature reserves, which, as you know, by their very status are of significance, and they are Castor Hanglands and Barnack Hills and Holes, and they are number 8 and number 9 in the jigsaw here. It also includes 2 small wildlife trust reserves at Souththorpe Meadow and Paddock, and then the 7 Langdyke reserves scattered across the area. We're also very fortunate that to the south, we have the Mean Park Trust and its land holding, who are great friends of Langdyke and one of the members of the John Clare Countryside Partnership. And to the north, bizarrely, we have the opportunities that are created by gravel extraction and a very strong and friendly relationship with the gravel extractors, and also the Welland Rivers Trust, who are looking at nature conservation along the northern of our 2 rivers. The John Clare Countryside Partnership launched its vision back in September 2019, although the concept had been around for some time. And those are our objectives about how we deliver significant increase in key wildlife habitat, and at the same time promote the health and well-being of general public, both those who live here and those who live on our doorstep in Peterborough and Stamford. And within that, we want those communities to understand, appreciate, enjoy, and indeed participate in the beauty of their local natural and built heritage. We currently, as a partnership, run at least 2 volunteer work parties per week. We will be upping that shortly because the demand and the interest is so significant. And we want this to be a place where farming flourishes too. Landowners and farmers are a huge part of what we are, of the partnership, as I'll show you in a minute. And as we take forward nature recovery, it needs to be in a way that drives, the successful, sustainable future of the built and farmed environment. From the start, we've worked hard to collect partners. It didn't take long. We don't have to sell ourselves too much because of the strength of what we're trying to do. And as many a partner has said, and I guess it's a flattering comment, what's not to like about this vision and about what we're trying to achieve. But you can just see there from that shortlist, there are other partners, that we have a range of statutory partners like Natural England, Natural Cambridgeshire, the Wildlife Trust, Neem Park Trust, local charities such as Sacrowell Farm, John Clare and he's got two charities that look after his interests, the developers like Tarmac. I would say just worth pointing out that Peterborough City Council have fully endorsed all the proposals in the John Clare Countryside project, not just the current administration, but unanimously at all party last year. But you'll also see three partners there who are landed estates. Most of the land around us is owned by those three estates, plus Neem Park Trust in the south. There are some private land holdings as well. But those three are on board and working with us to look at habitat creation opportunities and recognise this is how they're going to earn their corn in many ways as we go further forward into new agricultural subsidy regimes. So they are enthusiastic and we're having very detailed conversations with them. And as I'll say in a minute, with two of those estates, we've already got projects underway helping to create new habitats for nature and opportunities for people to enjoy nature. Wildlife Trust and Peterborough Environment City Council, the partnership continues to grow. One thing I thought I would major on in this talk is just how well grounded this is in the local community. Last year, as part of the vision, we launched the idea that every parish, and there are 16 of them, but one actually doesn't meet only meets once a year. So of the 16 parishes in the area, 15 of them have signed up to create their own nature recovery plans. And these vary from 10-page documents to an email with one bullet point in it saying we want to create an otter halt. And to us, that's fine, that's success. We don't put a rigid template on anybody's activity. We want local people to feel they're engaged in projects that mean something to them. And to date, through those parish nature recovery plans, we have over 41 projects identified. And through the goodwill of the City Council, Langdyke, Natural England and PECT, and one of the landed estates, I should mention, we were able to raise £26,000 to start those projects. And you can see many of them very small scale, swift boxes, bat boxes, short stretches of hedge planting, wildflower meadow strips in local recreation grounds, building ponds, also looking at how we manage churchyards and school grounds. But those nature recovery plans, as I say, one in each parish, and in each parish, groups of 5, 10, 20, 30 people getting together to take them forward. And I have to say that the activity was somewhat stymied by COVID restrictions. And as COVID restrictions relaxed, so the planting season narrowed. But already around the John Clare Countryside, you can see these signs popping up in all the villages, and some of the villages have 2 or 3 of them. We've got a nice universal branding, universal centrally supplied signposts, which each community can adapt, and then they put them alongside their project. So as you walk around our area, you get a sense of all the things that are going on. And here we've got some pond creation, we've got some wildflower meadows in the village, we've got some hedge planting, and we've got a nature space in a community allotment. Another picture here about putting in some tern rafts in one of the nature reserves. And the bee orchid on the right, I bring to your attention because this is part of a programme of road verge management that we are now piloting with Peterborough City Council. And one of the parishes identified a stretch of road verge where it wanted to protect because of a colony of bee orchids. And we've worked very closely with the council to achieve that. And we now have, I think, 36 spikes of bee orchid just on that simple stretch of road verge. And if you can do it there, then there's no reason why you can't do it across the many, many miles of flower-rich road verge in the John Clare Countryside. So local people coming up with the idea, talking to the council, delivering and celebrating success. In the autumn, we want to bring this together and probably have a series of coordinated events working with local schools, local churchyards, to get a sense of momentum and a sense of achievement as we take forward that kind of resident-led activity. And I think sometimes we might sort of, even I in the past might have thought, well, does a swift box or a bat box or 10 square meters of wildlife strip matter that much? And the answer is yes, it does, if every parish is doing it. And if 20 or 30 people in every parish are getting excited and involved in it, then it adds up. But we are also working at the major sort of habitat creation level. I'm not going to go through everything on this list. One of our partners, Nyman Park, has very ambitious plans for nature recovery on its estate. We're working with Burley up near Stamford, and already have a program of creating woodland walks and pond creation, working with their estate management team. We're now working with another of those large landowners on a whole estate habitat creation plan. Anglian Water are working with us on their sewage treatment works and several other bits of land they have in the area. Environment Agency, Internal Drainage Board, working very closely and very positively with them around potential for adding species-rich flowers along the linear drainage channels that cut across the north of John Clare Countryside. And we've also got examples of individually owned farms who want us to develop nature recovery programs across, 100 acres of farmland, wildflower strips, hedgerow, all that kind of thing. Briefly, just to mention again, we've also started to work, I think, again, quite excitingly in terms of its potential with pony paddock owners who, for various good reasons, want shade and they want natural environment for their horses. And we have a couple of opportunities to plant those up across probably through 20, 30 acres of land over the course of the next 6 to 8 months. And as I say, I think if we can get one of those right, there are real opportunities across the area. Churchyards, we've got the local rectors, both of them involved and very keen to see what can be done in the many churchyards that we have in each of the, well, one per parish as you'd expect. So lots of potential there too. Where next for us? I think we're still looking for that big headline project, and one of the ideas we've got is to marshal our forces behind the recreation of one of John Clare's most iconic landscapes, perhaps Aylesworth Heath, and recreate large areas of limestone grassland and the heathland that Clare would have known. We're looking on that basis to then put together a consolidated funding bid for multi-million pound bid to drive the programme forward. And I think we feel that with that combination of resident-led, local people, activity and engagement, plus the opportunities to work with the landowners to create the large habitats, then we have a big opportunity here. We would also very much, and we are lobbying for this, like to be included in the new environment opportunity areas that are being brought forward as part of the ARC consultations later this year. A bit of a rapid run through. I'm going to turn to Justin now to talk a little bit about the next steps from his point of view.
Thanks, Richard. If you're able to just sort of click onto the next slide, that'd help.
Of course. Thank you. Can I say? Oh, where's it gone?
Oh.
There we go.
There we go. There we go. Excellent. Thanks a lot for that, Richard. And I mean, that's, I think, one of the things that excites me particularly about this project is, as Richard's described, this community-led approach. It's looking at helping and facilitating those local communities, whether they're parish councils or working with individual landowners, to help describe what they would like to see in this area, and then the various sort of technically minded partners that are part of this coalition here, helping to sort of identify the routes that are best followed to actually enable that to happen on the ground. And I think in terms of sort of the momentum that's been gathered over the past year, when there's been so many hurdles in our way in terms of actually practically getting together and getting messages out, I think this project's come along at a huge rate. So there's a lot to like about it. One of the things that I might do, sorry, Helen, I've just received a message that I'm quite quiet. So let me see whether, is that any better? Hopefully. Okay, I'll continue, and I hope Richard will wave if I'm being too quiet. So, so in terms of the next steps, obviously we've identified a number of sort of projects that we'd like to take forward, particularly around sort of developing those individual jigsaw pieces within this nature recovery area through those parish nature recovery plans. The really exciting stuff is going to come through in the new tools that we've got available to us. We've already developed a lot in terms of the existing and traditional ways of working here, But the Environment Bill is really going to open up a whole host of other mechanisms for us in terms of both identifying the ambition and actually delivering it on the ground. It's all well and good having maps, but until you've actually used those maps and used those sort of all of that thought process to actually change a decision and actually enhance nature on the ground, then you've not actually delivered as yet. So the key things from a Natural England perspective are looking at the principles that are going to come forward around nature recovery areas. So the idea of significant scale of joining up the landscape, using biodiversity net gain, using things such as the future schemes, so whether that's the local nature recovery schemes or even the landscape recovery approach in this particular area, and also about how we connect people with nature. So we've already talked about how we've engaged with those parishes, and we've managed to sorry, there's still appears to be some issues with the noise. So I'll keep going as best I can. Yeah, so I think one of the things that really excites me in here is about how thinking about that connection of really large-scale nature recovery on the urban edge. And I think traditionally things such as growth have been seen as a particular threat. I think that, and in many cases they can be, but I think where we're working through the Oxcam partnership, where we're looking at things such as biodiversity net gain that will be delivered through a local nature recovery strategy. So the local nature recovery strategy will identify where those opportunities are. The biodiversity net gain will pay for that off-site mitigation where it can't be carried out within the scheme boundary. An area like John Clare Countryside, on the edge of one of the fastest growing cities in the whole country, actually has a huge opportunity to deliver effectively that idea of a green lung to the urban population. And I think that's where I can see a lot of benefits coming in future, potentially around that connecting people with nature, around groups that are traditionally perhaps underserved by the environment sector, some of the minority communities and young communities within the city of Peterborough. How do we use something like John Clare Countryside project to really help them connect with and experience and feel that they've got a stake in having a very rich, wildlife-rich natural area right on the doorstep of the city. So we will be looking closely at how the Environment Bill works its way through Parliament in the autumn, and then seeing where we can particularly use John Clare Countryside as a way to demonstrate and showcase how some of these new tools can be delivered in practice, because this strong and effective partnership that we've got here, I think is very much ready to deliver on these things. So we've got ample opportunity to be really leading the way in that sort of nature recovery on the urban edge here, building that, really linking in with that sort of heritage landscape, looking at the cultural connections, you know, the John Clare as a historical figure, the literature that he produced is another really strong connection here to why this is an important focus for our collective work. So there's a lot still to do, but significant steps have been made here, and I think there's a lot that other focus areas can learn from this particular landscape and indeed the very collaborative approach of this partnership.
Lovely, thanks, Justin. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm conscious that we're running over time, but does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask myself or Justin about that at all? Can you use the raise hand function in the reactions piece if you have? It's easy for me to see. Yes, I can see Councillor Anna Bradnam.
Yeah, that's lovely, and I'm really encouraged to hear what you're doing. And I'm sure you've already thought of working in schools to combine, you know, studies of the literature and the poetry with visits out into it and bringing back things to study into the classroom, and encouraging children to get out in the countryside, because the schools are very well equipped to use this sort of inclusive learning. And I'm sure engaging youngsters early on, and also previous links with the Wildlife Trust, actually engaging people in those activities that the Wildlife Trust do. Obviously children can't take part in work parties, but volunteering at weekends, that sort of thing, they can be really engaged with activities outdoors. And also engaging with businesses. I know the Wildlife Trust used to engage, still does engage with businesses who want to do work parties, to deliver, look after particular areas. And if you can get children involved with that as well, that would be great. Just some suggestions.
I know you're absolutely right. So again, I think it's part of the power of the offer here is that, everything that we're doing, the children in the local schools, they live here as well. It's right on their patch, so they're not having to go far. There's the kind of places they might go at the weekend for a walk with their family. So the 4 primary schools in the area are actively engaged, and we also have plans for each of the school grounds and how we can develop them for nature, and how we can improve nature recovery there. Local business is an interesting one. I mean, we have so many local businesses coming to us now looking for volunteering opportunities, which is fabulous. So we've just got to find the capacity to manage that. Rather than go and find it, but really, really positive that some of the larger and smaller companies are coming to us and asking if we can help them provide volunteering opportunities. Just a couple of questions on the chat. Someone was asking me about the art in the presentation. We've always had art as a very big theme in Langdyke's work, and that's translating into the John Clare Countryside project. Carrie Aykroyd, who is a great artist of Clare and his work, is one of our patrons and provided the illustrations for the presentation. In terms of working with the parish councils, we work very closely with them and with the City Council officers and the City Council Planning Authority. So we feel we've got tremendous support from the local authority, and delighted by that. And another thing that Matthew has added from the Nyman Park Trust in the chat there is around sustainable farming and local food. And it's great, Matthew, the work that you guys are doing down in Nyman Park Trust land to drive that forward. And I hope we can move that onto a wider scale across the whole area. I see Charles has raised his hand. Charles, hi.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just a thought. I mean, you've a fantastic presentation, and what you've achieved and what you are achieving is inspiring. But as you said, it's taken 22 years to get to that point. So I guess my question is, if there are other areas of our broader patch where people are inspired by what you do and would like to be doing something similar, I'm sure there are many lessons you've learned that you could share. I mean, how long do you feel realistically it would take another patch, a group of neighbourhoods, parishes, sort of getting themselves together and starting from scratch to be able to start making a real impact as you're doing in John Clare country?
I can't answer that question. I just don't know the answer. I would say that things have changed though so much that whilst it might not be that everything happens on day one, but I think the mood has changed. Even back in 1999, it felt like we were sort of pushing certainly against landowners and tenant farmers, I need to be honest, who really didn't know what we were about and why they should pay us any attention. Whereas now, again, we're having landowners come to us and say, could you help me with my application into the new Elm scheme or into the next environmental scheme? So they're actually coming to us to ask for that. I think there is a bit of a blueprint, and we'd be happy to share it. I'm also talking to 1 or 2 other groups nationally about whether we can create a sort of more national framework for some of these small community groups to help them and to offer sort of peer support. I think it comes down to keeping it local though. I think that's what the sort of the message certainly from Langdyke, and rather than the rest of the partnership here, is our members want to be able to take the dog for a walk and see nature and put it on the Facebook group and come on events, come on workshops, and learn about their locality. And I think that's probably pertinent to all areas, including urban areas, actually. So it's not going to be a sort of you can just click your fingers and it happens, Charles. You have to build momentum. But I would have thought, that within sort of, a year, 18 months, I think people could be starting to see the fruits of their action, particularly. And if you think about the parish plans, they were only announced last May, and we've already got 41 projects that are happening. So that's a slightly different aspect to it. That's just taken off.
And I think Richard, just to follow on from that, in terms of your question, Charles, I'd say the difference between the financial incentives now and the ability to actually, a lot of for the major projects, landowners have had to work within the economic constraints of their businesses, following those schemes that have been out there. The change in how we manage landscapes and the funding available for that is going to be such a significant driver in terms of allowing people to change their business plans, to do stuff that they probably wanted to do for a long time, or at least, at the very least, are ambivalent one way or another. It will keep that business sustained if you are being paid to farm nature, or looking at, particularly around one of the things that we've not particularly mentioned, but the climate agenda, and that step change in terms of, as a country, we are investing in how nature can help us with that, tackling that climate resilience and particularly in a county such as Cambridgeshire. There's abundant opportunity there, whether it's with the peat, whether it's looking at our major water courses that we have through the county, tree planting in areas that are in the right place. There's a number of things there that will really help us engage with some of those folk who, despite perhaps wanting to do things in the past, the economics haven't stacked up. So I think that's a major change for us as well.
Lovely. So I'm now going to have to kind of put both hats on and say to myself, Richard and Justin, you've completely overrun on time, very remiss. Time to close you down and move on. But thank you very much indeed, Justin and sort of Richard. So yeah, lots in the chat about how we kind of move this forward, and I'm very happy if people want to get in touch with me. I think it's something we should look at. This isn't the only example in Cambridgeshire. There are other just as good examples, and I think we just need to see how we can drive the momentum across communities, and I think that could stand us all in good stead. So let me move on to the next items on the agenda. I've got Marcus Nyman from the RSPB and Daniel Zeitner to talk to us. Now, can I just check on your time constraints, both of you, because I know one of you at least has to leave. Daniel, is it you have to be off by 11?
Soon after, yes.
And Marcus,
sorry about that.
How long have we got you for?
11, yeah.
You have to as well, right? Then we better get going. So, Marcus, if you could start us from your perspective, please, that would be very, very helpful.
Yeah, certainly. I'll just share my screen and let me know.
Have you got sharing rights? Yeah, good man. Thank you.
Is that sharing? Okay,
yeah.
Good. Well, yes, thanks for the opportunity to speak. I sort of stepped in last minute for Mike Maunder of the CCI, so and I've assumed his title as well with my own interpretation of what that might mean. So hopefully it speaks to some key points for the group and the people on the call. But yeah, happy to be speaking. So who am I? Marcus Nyman, Senior Policy Officer at RSPB. I sit in a team called Future Nature in the Policy and Advocacy Department, which essentially is a small team dedicated to looking at the wider drivers of loss in biodiversity and nature, and looking towards the kind of drivers of recovery, a little bit beyond the sort of traditional conservation remit. So we kind of look at the money, basically look at governance, we look at how to put money into nature, into good things in a way, and take it away from bad things, with a kind of slightly wider remit than sort of the typical idea of RSPB policy. And one area where I'm kind of focused on is how to think about these shifts at the local scale, so really relevant to Natural Cambridgeshire, and how to rewire or reframe local places with nature at their heart. So yeah, very happy to be talking today. Let me just, is it going to, there we go. So yeah, just a few things I wanted to talk about on the kind of theme of what it means to put nature at the heart of decision making. I wanted to just contextualize it a little bit of kind of the moment we find ourselves in, and I think Richard's kind of hinted at that earlier as well. There is a sense of change, a sense of a shift, even if it's not necessarily linear. So I wanted to kind of flag that. the kind of the need for urgency and ambition. I think the idea of decision making and putting nature at the heart of decision making, there are big drivers, big levers to be pulled, and we've sort of hinted at them, some of them already. But following that, I kind of wanted to highlight that there's the importance of getting it right at the kind of at the small scale, at the kind of the individual scale at which decisions are made. I think there's quite an interesting discussion about how you pull big levers and then kind of frame the local or the immediate context in which those decisions are made. And yeah, just I'll finish up on a kind of a little bit of a provocation, a little bit of a question about what this might mean at the local scale, and some of the thinking we've been doing there. So yeah, so the kind of the moment we find ourselves in, for me at least, it feels like there's a shift in the world moving. As I say, it's not linear, it's not simple. Nature is complex. It's unlikely to be without barriers and challenges along the way, but there's various things happening at the moment, from kind of seeking global consensus through the CBD and COP26. Various recent announcements from the government have kind of explicitly included the term nature positive, which is really about not just managing loss, but actually pushing towards an economy which produces more nature, more access to nature, more improvements in biodiversity. And that's an interesting change, I think, that goes alongside net zero. The kind of, post-Brexit context in law and policy with the Environment Bill, as was just discussed by Justin, farm reform and some of the kind of the ELMs or the schemes within what was ELMs, signifying a major shift. Again, not simple, not complete. This is provisional, it's ongoing, but there's something changing in the world. For our perspective, the kind of Dasgupta review back in March is potentially a really important reframing of the economics of biodiversity and nature, that is no longer just an add-on, that nature is recognised as critical to all of our thriving and all of our success. As also mentioned before, kind of increasingly public consciousness about the importance of nature, and certainly a kind of wider political public traction being gained in terms of net zero and decarbonisation alongside nature and biodiversity. So there's something happening, in essence, is what I'm trying to say here, and potentially quite big shifts on the go. So yeah, it's pointing towards how to put nature at the heart of decision making. Well, one way to do that is to use big decisions and big levers to kind of rewire the way in which decisions are made, the kind of the drivers, the motivations, the regulation, the punitive elements of how things should or shouldn't be done. So a few of these would be new sources of money, either directly or indirectly into nature. Money makes a difference of how people make decisions. For example, then the Green Book, as a kind of a way in which to green spending, which is not directly about nature, but actually can have a major impact on it, is potentially really kind of quite significant framing for those decisions. Big kind of targets within the Environment Bill. There's a framework for legally binding targets for biodiversity, and there's also been kind of much discussed state of nature target, which would aim to halt the declines in biodiversity by 2030. Now, there's been some amendment to the bill, not necessarily all that we'd want to see, but the idea that targets can actually kind of drive through decision making in government and out into business, and the way in which organisations function, and 30 by 30, another kind of major commitment, which is kind of top down, big picture, but potentially quite transformative. There are new, enhanced obligations within the Environment Bill, which again can kind of change and alter the ways in which individual decisions are made, sort of on the ground through public, basically specifically an enhanced obligation on biodiversity for all public bodies, are potentially quite transformative if undertaken in the right context. Again, going back to the kind of the COPs ongoing this year, international agreements have that same kind of potential to drive through into individual decisions, as well as the proposed OEP for England, and in some sense for Northern Ireland as well. Kind of the ability to effectively regulate and have effective regulators is another way in which really kind of you can drive nature positive thinking into individual decision makings, and also hold people to account for when they do not do that. There's proposed reform of the planning system, questions around environmental assessment, which we'd have some reservations about ourselves, but there is potential to reframe the decisions made through planning, which has such a massive impact on biodiversity and the prospects for its recovery. And then there's also the potential to look at kind of the incentives, fiscal policy, which would also have the potential to rewire the way in which decisions are made, the motivations, whether that's for profit or other ways of thinking. I suppose my point for for highlighting this is, firstly, there's a massive need for urgency and ambition in what we're actually doing at sort of national government level, and that these really can impact, and we're spending a lot of time trying to influence these to make sure they are actually doing what they should do. From my perspective, there's also a kind of another consideration, which is actually these will never fall on a kind of on a blank piece of paper. Those who actually make decisions, whether they're investments or policies or individuals making decisions about what they buy or the habits they have in sort of daily life, they never happen in a kind of blank context. So I think there's an important point, and this, if anything, is the key thing I'd like to emphasize, is that those key policy mechanisms mentioned in the previous slide have to come in the context of helping people make decisions in practice. And I think there's all sorts of softer things which happen, which are less flashy, they're less exciting in some ways, but can be really kind of instrumental and really important to the ways in which decisions are actually made. So, for example, the National Audit Office produced a report at the end of November last year, basically examining the capacity for government to achieve its long-term environmental goals, and it highlighted all sorts of interesting aspects of how that can be done. One of which was to set the big picture, to set a vision towards which we might all be working towards, but others were around oversight and coordination, ensuring there is the kind of the right relationships between different parts of government, for example, ensuring there's the opportunity to cooperate and share information, avoid working in silos. I think critical both for what I'm talking about here, but also some of the stuff around local nature recovery strategies, mapping, other important mechanisms for making decisions is around data and information, having the right resources and expertise to inform that, and that can make or break some of the kind of the policy mechanisms that we're talking about. Interestingly, yeah, institutional cultures, like how do institutions work towards a particular goal, or within themselves? How do they kind of frame what decisions should and shouldn't be made? These can be really impactful for how, and this is not just about government either. This can be big businesses. It could be the farming sector. All sorts of things about the kind of the culture of how we make decisions. Another thing pointed out by the National Audit Office was around monitoring, learning, improvement, and actually it's critical for making good decisions. And this is something I should emphasise as well. Putting nature at the heart of decision making is not just about nature, but actually making sure those are good decisions being made, transparent, good governance, accountable, and driven towards actually improvement over time. So that's an interesting point to highlight, that the monitoring, learning, improvement takes time, takes effort, needs support, but can be absolutely critical to success. And then motivations, values, and habits. I think there's the example I often go back to is some previous work on kind of public procurement, sustainable public procurement, which is often seen as government spends enormous amounts of money. Therefore, if you pull the lever, you can have a massive impact, which is absolutely true and something where we should be working. But at the same time, public procurement is a particular function of government with particular kind of values, habits, different sorts of people involved in it. So, for example, those involved in public procurement are far less likely to want to take risks because they don't have a profit motivation at the end of it. They are often working within quite specific sort of institutional legal frameworks, and so it's quite not always easy to shift practice. They're also often generalists. They're not necessarily specialists in specific things, so they need help and tools and support along the way. So I think it's an interesting example of where decision making, which happens every day, which has massive impact on the kind of the prospects of nature and biodiversity, what we spend our money on, whether that's roads or coffee, can really impact the prospects for nature, and government spends an enormous amount in its kind of everyday business, but it's not just a single decision, it's lots of individual decisions taken in quite specific institutional context. So the thing I quite like to emphasize is that we have the big levers, but we also need to understand where those levers actually fall. And so with that in mind, a kind of one piece of work that I'm I'm developing at the moment, and it speaks quite nicely to Natural Cambridgeshire's ideas and way of working. And I said it's an interesting. A couple of people on the call 2 weeks ago, we had a kind of an away day. The team, it's a small team, so we took the opportunity to kind of be in person, thinking through some of the questions really related to what it would mean to put nature at the heart of specifically local decision making. How do you embed nature as a kind of a part of place, the economic, the political, the social, and not just invest in nature conservation on individual sites, but how can you green the spending? How can you make the spending of government and businesses more nature positive across the board? So it was an interesting kind of opportunity, and ended up visiting a couple of people on the call, looking at different approaches to farming, nature-friendly farming. Gavin's there, visited co-farm in Cambridge City as well, to think about different ways in which we might connect nature to what it means for a place to function well, and not just in an economic sense, but how nature and investment in nature can help government deliver multiple goals, which is an increasingly clear case being made, and I think is highlighted already on the meeting so far. And then how can nature demonstrate recognisable public value? How does it offer identity to people and place, not just as a nice to have and add on, but as an integral part of the way things function? So yeah, I think I basically addressed the question of the theme of how to put nature at the heart of decision making. I'm very happy to answer questions now. I'm not sure how you want to sort of facilitate that, Richard. I'm happy to wait a little bit and let Daniel.
So that's great, actually, and I have to say, I hope this doesn't sound patronising. It aligns so much. It kind of reassures me that Natural Cambridgeshire is on the right path, which is good, and partly, of course, because we've got you guys on our board. So it's good that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. What I'm going to do, though, is just without further ado, I'm going to actually invite our local MP, Daniel Zeichner, to speak next, and then we'll just see how much time you guys can spare for questions at the end of that. But I'm just conscious you've both got other places to go, and also feeling very guilty because I can only blame myself for intruding on your time, so I do apologise for that. Daniel, if I may, can I pass to you for your thoughts, please?
Well, thanks so much, Richard, and apologies. The Australian trade deal is being unveiled this morning, which is why I'm going to have to dash off in a few minutes. But could I first of all thank you and congratulate you on the amazing work you're doing. It's lovely to see some familiar faces on the call, and it's inspiring hearing what you're doing. I was particularly taken by Marcus's comments about the softer factors, because I think they're really important. First of all, let me say, what are my credentials to talk to you about this? There are many experts, people on this call. I've been interested in environmental policy making in my own party for many years. And for the last 18 months, I've had the privilege of being one of the shadow environment ministers, particularly responsible for food, farming and rural affairs. And in that role, I found myself leading the opposition in committee on the agriculture bill last year and for some parts of the environment bill, which has given me a kind of detailed insight into some of that. I'll return to that in a moment. You asked me to talk about COP26 and COP15, which are, of course, the two major conferences on climate and on biodiversity. I have to say that politicians in our country have very little role in this, sadly. You might have seen with the G7 this week, the Prime Minister may turn up in Parliament on Wednesday to talk about it. He may not. Basically, Parliament is pretty much cut out of these things, and we have no formal role in either COP26 or COP15. We will be observers, commentators, and speculators, as many on this call will be. What I would just reflect, though, is I think particularly at the moment, so much of this is about China. It's about international diplomacy, and there's plenty that's problematic about China and the behaviour of their government at the moment. But I have to say, I am also slightly saddened by the constant attacks from some parts of our own political establishment. If you read the Times, you'll see virtually every week now there's a double-page spread at the weekend attacking Cambridge and China, and I don't think that helps particularly in trying to build engagement in tackling what are global problems. But let me just say a little bit about a few things which I can tell you a bit more about in Parliament, and it's very timely. We've been talking about the Environment Bill. Well, that's actually still going. It's only just reached the House of Lords after years and years, frankly, far too slow in my view. And perhaps more important in many ways was the Dasgupta review, which was commissioned by the government, a huge piece of work, of course, by one of our academics in Cambridge. And yesterday, actually, the government responded to it. And many of you on the call will know it's a 700-page piece of work. It basically makes a very strong economic argument for putting nature at the centre of everything we do, absolutely reflecting that we cannot keep consuming nature and we must replenish it. I think the government's response was probably pretty much what you'd expect. Lots of warm words, but I think on the key big issues of actually tackling GDP as our key indicator, exactly what you'd expect, backing off from that. And I had to say, I would compare a little with the Stern review from some 10, 15 years ago. I remember I was in meetings when Gordon Brown was announcing that and making a point just how important it would be for the future discussion. I do think the Stern review did absolutely change the terms of the debate. The question is, will this review do the same for nature? And at the moment, I fear not. I think it's striking that if you look at the newspapers and the news reports this morning, was that review leading the front pages and the government's response? No, it wasn't. And I think it's going to be part of the challenge that all of us have got to, who are concerned about this, to try and get the nature emergency dealt with in the same way and brought into the public mind in the same way as the climate emergency. On the Environment Bill, obviously I'm pleased to hear positive responses in the previous presentations. I have to say I'm a little less positive, a bit more spiky about it, as you might imagine. Much of it, of course, was demanded by our departure from the European Union, which had strong environmental laws. And many of us are disappointed to see that the environmental regulator, if you like, the Office of Environmental Protection, looks much weaker than the European Commission. And of course, from a government's point of view, one can understand why they might quite like that, because they kept getting taken to court and being beaten. Well, I don't think that's going to happen in the future. That may be convenient for government, but it really isn't very good for the environment. And of course, the Environment Bill, act as it will be when it finally gets through the Lords, came from the 25-year environment plan that was established by Michael Gove a few years ago. And I suspect a number of people on the call probably quite influential in that. And there was much in that to admire. But throughout the passage of the Environment Bill, certainly I and others kept pointing out where it seemed, frankly, to fall short. And I would say there are a lot of very positive environmental words coming from the government, but they're not entirely matched by the actions. And without going through the details, one's only got to look at the targets that are being missed on tree planting and so on. Very disappointing on air quality, for instance, that our constant pressure to include the World Health Organization targets were not accepted by government. And on the subject, particularly for the day, on biodiversity net gain, we had a whole series of conversations about this in committee. Many people wanted to see a more ambitious target than a 10% gain, limited for 30 years. We wanted it in perpetuity. There are many questions as to how it will work in practice. I guess that will fall on some of you to try and work out how it actually works. But I have to say, for me, the elephant in the room throughout that was the planning white paper from last year. And I kept asking the question of ministers, and I keep on asking the question of ministers, how can the two possibly work together? If you've got areas of the country that are designated for development, it's very hard to see how you achieve biodiversity net gain within that context. And it's also got to be put in the context, of course, of some of the colourful language used by the Prime Minister. Build, build, build was his message. And in passing, he, of course, had this statutory swipe at what I think of probably people like us, who he described as newt counters. Now, it's hard to reconcile that kind of language with some of the positive things we've been hearing around the 25-year environment plan and some of the measures in the Environment Bill. So I suppose I spent last week reading Dieter Helm's recent book, Net Zero, and he basically said that we're not doing nearly well enough. And I think when you look at the overall figures, whether it's tree planting, whether it's the quality of our river water, whether it's our air quality, of course, when the HE targets were examined, I think a year ago by the RSPB, 17 out of 20 missed. I'm afraid I find it hard to be optimistic about where we are at the moment. Just last week, there was an opportunity with the government's new research agency to absolutely put all of its efforts into tackling climate change. Ed Miliband and I spoke passionately on that. Government really weren't interested, and they will have their reasons that they say that wasn't the appropriate place to do it. It seemed to us to be a great chance to really put all that resource and effort we've shown that the scientific community can bring when it tackled COVID to tackle what seems to us to be the climate change challenge of the year. So I see in the chat that someone thinks it's not appropriate for a political speech. I'm afraid if you ask a politician to speak to you, you're going to get politics, and I make no apology for that. So I think this is incredibly serious, and I hope that with the measures that are available to people, the tools that have been talked about by people like Marcus, I hope you will be able to do the things that we all want to achieve. I just have some skepticism as to whether that's what will actually turn out. Obviously, we hope that both COP26 and COP15 go well. Kunming, I think, is still on COP15 in China, which is an interesting challenge in itself. But I don't think there's any doubt amongst many politicians just how serious this challenge is. The question is, can we get the frameworks in place to allow people like yourselves to translate those into action? Thank you very much, Richard.
No, Daniel, thank you very much indeed. And we do try and keep the political balance as much as possible. We have invited and will be inviting pretty much all our MPs to speak to us. We had Anthony Brown previously, and Councillor Tierney, you'll have a chance to speak later. But we are obviously an apolitical organisation. We are united by a desire to see nature recover and people benefit from that recovery. And it's great to get lots of different perspectives and to hear those. And I think we're all aware the challenge is huge. And I sometimes wake up in the morning and think it's probably best to stay in bed and bury your head under the covers because of the challenge.
Don't do that.
Change and biodiversity is so great. And other days I get up and do something about it. So
quite right.
I think we've got to try and do more of the latter and less of the former. Thank you so much, Daniel and Marcus. If you've got time for sort of 3 or 4 minutes, so just a couple of
sure, yeah.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Who would like to go first? Again, if you could use the raise your hand in the chat, it helps me greatly because I can't see everybody on screen. Okay. Okay. Well, in that case, I'm gonna chuck a question your way. Marcus first. Do you feel the RSPB? I mean, what is its role, do you think, in galvanising communities? Because to me, there's this interesting top-down and bottom-up sort of approach, and we hear a lot about your work at the top. Do you think that the sort of stuff we were talking about before around sort of the John Clare Countryside and the other projects we have going on in Natural Cambridgeshire, how do they fit together and how do they align with the policy momentum?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I suppose one of the benefits and challenges of the organisation is that it's large and does lots of things, and so the kind of the policy piece is often at the top and sort of at potentially kind of distant sometimes from the kind of the on the ground things happening. But actually, our kind of the sites and reserves network is a really powerful way to into things on the ground and have a kind of vested interest in particular places, and it's something we're very conscious of, particularly in the kind of post-COVID I say post-COVID, it's still the COVID era, but I mean understanding and recognising this groundswell of interest in nature and recognising the importance of access to nature and people's enjoyment of it. It's certainly affecting the way that we're thinking about our policy asks. So as I was sort of mentioning before, kind of money into nature conservation is one thing, money into other things such as health services, transport, which is also able to deliver nature outcomes, is really critical, and being open to those possibilities is really quite important, I think. And yeah, it's something that I'm particularly thinking about, how we can kind of connect together that policy and practice, the kind of the people we have on the ground and the people we're connected to, and empowering communities to do some of that as well, and not necessarily be the ones who are having to take the lead. Recognizing the interests and expertise, like you were mentioning, is something which is it's certainly a part of our kind of future looking strategy, which is sort of actually in development at the moment. So yeah, very much conscious of it, and it's a work in progress, but something that I'm particularly working on with that local framing in mind.
Lovely, thank you. Councillor Bradnam has got her hand raised again. Lovely.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Really interesting analysis of the government's approach to the Environment Bill and the approach to being positive nature. And I'm just wondering what you think would be the most powerful way of influencing the government. Usually it comes down to money, and I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for how this group, for example, can give government the evidence that would make it understand that actually, the financial and evidence-based information that would make it understand that this is really crucial.
I think it's a really good question, and let me be frank. There are clearly very different views within government and battles that go on. I think we're going to see that play out just today around some of the trade deals, and these are hard things, because there are some huge decisions to be made about how we use our land in our country, how much we value our food production. Can we, and we've got some brilliant advocates, I see Martin Lyons on the call, for farming in a more sustainable way, but big questions as to how much we import, how much we support our farmers through changes to our payment support systems. So massive things to discuss, and very different views between political parties, but also within political parties. So in terms of answering your question, I would say where we can show that locally we are, with the tools already available to us, and I think there's some fantastic work going on in the Fens, being able to make a difference, then that must surely strengthen the hand of those who want, in my view, to adopt a more constructive, progressive position. But one should be in no doubt that in any government, particularly the Treasury, is always very, very cautious. And the battle between Treasury and other departments goes on government after government. And there are many who will argue that the main aim should be cheap food. And this is not a new argument, it goes, well, I'm tracing back historically back to the last century as well. Cheap food, and if you want cheap food, there are consequences from it. But if you want a sustainable environment, I and many others, I suspect on this call too, would argue that if you do it in the right way, you can actually get the right mix. Truth is, at the moment, probably our food is probably too cheap in this country. It may seem a difficult thing for politicians to say, but we have probably, I think, we're the third cheapest food in terms of the money our population spends on it, and that has some environmental consequences. But politically, how you get from where we are now to where we might want to be in the future is a complicated question. But give them good examples, and that helps.
I particularly like the fact that we've gone back to the Corn Laws already with the debate on cheap food, Daniel. So it's good to see the history never changes. We seem to be going anyway. No, enough. And there's some huge questions in the chat. One of which is, what is your prophecy on climate change, Daniel? So why don't we leave that one with you?
I'm ever an optimist, Richard. I always believe you can find solutions if the goodwill is there. But we are in a race. There's no two ways about it, and we're going to have to make some hard decisions. And it's always easier to duck them. But yeah. I remain optimistic. And thank you for all the work that you'll do.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your campaigning and for your support for us. It's been great to have you with us. And let's stay in touch, please. It'd be
definitely
helpful. And I think as Marcus, Marcus, you're still here. Thank you for finding the time at short notice to join us.
No worries at all. Thanks for the
the RSPB does a fantastic job in keeping these issues live and helping nature recover. So we're all keen and enthusiastic supporters of your work too. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I have to run. Thanks. Bye.
Good luck with the trade talks. And
thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. By all means, stay, but I know you've probably got to go as well. I'm going to move us on. There's lots of questions in the chat, and not all of which we can answer now. But we're going to move on to look at the role of the natural environment in economic decision making. And our first speaker is Matthew Agarwala. I probably pronounced that wrong, Matthew. I do apologise. I can't see you on the screen, but as soon as you speak, I think you're going to appear. Is Matthew with us? Peter, do you know if he should be with us? Is anybody there?
He said that he would be free from 10:30, so maybe he will still come.
Okay, well, we can move on and come back to Matthew. And if he's still struggling to get his microphone to work, just flag it in the chat, Matthew. I can't see you immediately. But let's start with Adrian Cannard from the Combined Authority, who's going to give us a little bit of an update on the work on climate change strategies across both the local authorities, but also the wider work of the Combined Authority and the Independent Climate Change Commission. Adrian, nice to see you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me along today to give an update on where we are. Just as a bit of context, I guess, as introduction to this, we have 8 local authorities within Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, with a wide variety of responsibilities, 5 districts, 1 unitary, 1 county council, and more recently 1 combined authority, which brings together those previous authorities. And I think the real important point to recognise straight away is that every day local authorities are undertaking activity that's supporting the environment or having an impact on the environment, whether that's dealing with our waste, public green space, monitoring air quality, planning decisions. There is activity that's undertaken that impacts on nature and the environment. But one of those which I'm here to talk about is how authorities are responding to the question of climate change that came up in that previous discussion. Now we have, of our authorities, 5 of them have produced specific climate change strategies. Others are addressing the issue through their corporate policies and individual planning and other activities. So we are in a place where we are at different stages. Some authorities have been producing action plans for some time. I think the City Council, Cambridge City Council, is on its 4th iteration, looking forward over the next 5 years with its action plan. It's very important that in responding to climate change, we are looking at the evidence base. And that's why, as the Combined Authority, we set up the Independent Climate Change Commission under Dame Julia Brown to look at this. And that reported its first report in March, which went through a number of aspects. So the first was, what are the climate change risks specific to Cambridgeshire and Peterborough? And as many of you will be aware, they cover the sort of core topics of flooding, overheating, water supply, and biodiversity change. It's worth reflecting that it was only a couple of years ago that I think it was Cambridge City that reached 38.7 degrees in the July heat wave. And so we are already experiencing extremes of climate, and those are predicted to happen more frequently as we go forward. And obviously, if we don't control emissions globally, then those incidences are going to increase significantly. The Commission then looked at the 2 aspects. One is mitigation, so how can we reduce greenhouse gases, and what role can Cambridgeshire and Peterborough play in that? And then adaptation, so what do we need to be doing to adapt to these more extreme climate occurrences? All of the climate change strategies that we have recognise the absolute fundamental role of nature in this agenda. So the nature-based solutions in tackling both emissions and adaptation, whether that's increasing the tree canopy to reduce overheating in urban areas, or using nature-based solutions in terms of slowing down floodwaters and making those flash floods less of an impact on our communities and our land use. A number of authorities, either within their climate change strategies or as separate strategies, include biodiversity actions to pick up the impact on nature. I've got a few examples of what those climate change strategies are attempting to do. Obviously, there is a whole range of actions because of the scope that local authorities have to cover. But in terms of some of the things that have been mentioned this morning, we've talked about the biodiversity net gain. The County Council have a commitment to actually achieve 20% rather than 10% by 2030 on biodiversity net gain. And our planners are working together to look at how, when the Environment Bill becomes an act, we would implement the approach to biodiversity net gain across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough to the best effect and the most efficient way of delivering the benefits that it can deliver. I've talked about trees, so authorities actually have targets to increase the tree canopy Huntston's District Council looking to increase it by 20% by 2030, Peterborough by 10%. South Cambridgeshire District Council have run a very successful, and this is a bit of a tongue twister, but 3 trees for free, or 3 free trees to parish councils, and also have locality budgets that are encouraging low carbon solutions to come forward. On planning, a number of the climate change strategies highlight the role that planning can play. Obviously, our local plans already very much are developed on the basis of sustainable development, but a number of authorities have produced specific climate change supplementary planning guidance or biodiversity supplementary planning guidance. And some of the new measures that are becoming more deliverable are things like the sustainable urban drainage systems, where we're using nature-based design on new estates to reduce the amount of surface runoff and to slow down that impact on the natural environment and our water-based system. There's a whole range of activity going on around the farming and land use aspects. So as part of the commission, the Combined Authority has supported work on local bottom-up investigation of peat issues by, I'm sure John's going to come on to talk on this later, in terms of addressing really what is the type of peats that we do have remaining in our area, and to get some better science on the emissions that might be being produced, and to feed that back up into the system. Obviously, we have the top-down work being done by DEFRA and the National Committee on Climate Change on land use and peat in particular, which is a big issue for us, obviously, in terms of its social and economic impact, as well as its natural environment impact. In terms of the co-benefits, it's a real theme that's come out through the work of the Commission and the individual climate change strategies of nature. Even the other aspects, such as increasing health opportunities, people's access to green space, has been really important during the pandemic, and it's just highlighted the deficit in a wide range of our areas that needs to be addressed. I think the other thing to bear in mind with the climate change strategy is local authorities are looking to show leadership on this, but actually we all need to make action at a local level and individually. If you look at the actual direct impact of local authorities in terms of their own operations, they tend to be relatively small percentages of the overall emissions that we've got. So although they all are looking to reduce their own emissions, and certainly the Combined Authority is looking at measures that we can do as well, the impact of businesses and residents in terms of how they move and heat their homes is really important. And what we're seeing and want to encourage is a link up between local authority work, third sector and businesses in terms of corporate responsibility around tackling emissions. And we're starting to have some interest in terms of private sector investment into the environment around habitat creation and offsetting. And we're very keen through the strategies that have come forward that these offsettings aren't a means to carry on business as usual and then claim the credits to offset that. The offsetting is very much needs to be reserved for those things that we can't reduce emissions from overall. And finally, just to sort of summarize where we're headed, is that the Climate Change Commission, that was a phase 1 report, and the second phase, which it's working on at the moment, has a specific group looking at adaptation, nature-based solutions and water. And so we'll get a lot more information and some additional recommendations later in the year, just before we get into the COP26 period. So there is more work to come on that link up between climate change and nature-based solutions as we take it forward. And I think the other thing that we're looking to explore is more about where the costs fall. And I noticed Pippa made a comment in the chat around the undervaluing of natural capital, or the lack of valuing of natural capital. The Commission highlighted that the residents and areas most vulnerable to climate change are potentially the same residents that are possibly least able to respond to those. And so a fair transition and trying to work out the costs of these different measures are going to be really important as we all take this work forward.
Lovely, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, and rightly, as you point out, we've got this work going forward in the second stage of the Commission to really sort of expand the policy recommendations around the role of nature. Thank you for that, Adrian. I thought we'd go straight to you, John, then, just to talk about an important part of the Commission's work that you're leading on around fenland peat, and perhaps get an update from you on where we are on that. Thank you. And perhaps just introduce yourself as at the start. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Good morning, everybody. Or still, yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm John Shropshire. I'm chairman of a family farming business that actually farms based in the Fens, but we also farm actually extensively throughout England, and we operate in Europe and farm in Africa as well. So quite wide-ranging farming capability, supplying fresh produce, so salads and vegetables, to the European market, but our biggest marketplace is the UK. We supply year-round a range of products. The subject of peat is, as Adrian has just explained, this is of national importance, and it actually has a prominent position in the Conservative government's climate change policy and in their 6th carbon budget. And the reason for that is that in Cambridgeshire Fens alone, there's an estimate that up to 2.6 million tonnes of carbon dioxide is coming out of the soil each year, which equates to 45% of Cambridgeshire's total emissions. But this is only an estimate, and actually it could easily be out by double or more. So it's a really difficult subject when you don't have actually accurate numbers. Peat, as it degrades, when it's drained, peat degrades after drainage. The oxygen comes in, flora and fauna start eating it, basically, and the carbon dioxide is given out. But we don't really know how much is given out of the different types of peat. And we've got a whole range of peats in the Cambridgeshire Fens, from deep peat to what are called wasted peats. And, the wasted peats are actually used to be peat, but there's no peat left, because as the peat degrades, you end up with a position where there's none left. And some of that actually is our best farmland, because as the peat degrades, you used to farm the subsoil, and often the subsoil is silt clay, which is very, very good soil. So that is good land, and there's no peat left anyway. Clearly, logic would tell us that the deep peats are emitting more than the shallow peats, and certainly a lot more than the wasted peats, which are probably not emitting any more than any other mineral soil. So what we actually also don't have a very good idea of is actually how much CO2 is emitted from farming outside the Fens. So we can't do a comparison of saying, well, there's twice as much carbon dioxide produced in the Fens as there is farming out on the mineral soils and the uplands, as I call them. So we don't really have a good idea of that either. So therefore, what we need to do is actually establish a whole farm system appraisal to understand the total environmental impact of moving farming out of the fens, for example, into mineral highland soils and maybe inevitably abroad. Now, the background to this, of course, is that economically and strategically, the fens produce 7% of the nation's food on only 4% of the land. And in Cambridgeshire, Peterborough region alone, there's 80,000 people employed in farming and the supply chain of the food industry. And it's producing over £1.5 billion worth of products for the local market. And it equates to 1/3 of the country's output of fresh produce, salads and vegetables. So what are we going to do about this? And Adrian's just introduced this for me, so thank you, Adrian. But to tackle the issue, the government has set up a lowland peat task force with national and regional committees. But the combined authority has formed a peat committee and for the CPCA, and has provided us with some funding, which will be matched by the farmers, because it has to be to get it. And this work will take a few years, because there's quite a lot of experiments here and work that's ongoing. And we do need a budget really for 5 years, and we're going to be pushing to actually work with the CPCA to get 5 years of funding for this at least. Our aim is to play an active part in developing a national policy for lowland peat and to make a difference by also changing farming practices in the fens, thereby, mitigating CO2 emissions. On the committee that we've set up, the peat committee, we have a number of farmers, as you'd expect, and also leading conservation groups and leading scientists on this subject from the NIAB, Cambridge University, Cranfield and Bangor universities, and plus 1 or 2 local movers and shakers, and they're actually on the call this morning, so thank you always to their help. So the aims of this committee are to coordinate between farmers and hydrological and other scientific advisors to interact with DEFRA's Lowland Peat Task Force. It does also to undertake surveys and mapping so we can actually understand how much peat there is, because we don't know, and also to evaluate farming practice mitigations that include things like regenerative farming techniques, which are pioneered by some of the other farmers on the call today, and water table control. So we also are going to be reviewing the opportunities for polluter and we're going to consider at a farm level the contribution a nature recovery network and doubling of nature ambition can make to emissions mitigation, because obviously it can. And we actually have a vision that we're going to create in the fens a mosaic or patchwork of different methods of controlling the subject and delivering our nature commitments. We're also going to work to understand how elms and other funding mechanisms, including carbon credits, can play a role. And to quote Richard earlier on at the beginning, we have to earn our corn in the farming community, and this could be possibly one way of achieving that. Also, we're going to be monitoring and assessing, of course, the economic and social impacts of farming in the economy and the communities in the fens. So far, to help, in order to help everyone understand what is actually happening in the field, we've set up several visits from the scientific community, from civil servants, conservationists, scientists, researchers, and the chair of the Lowland Peat Task Force. The climate change commissioners will be visiting in July, and next we need to get the politicians to visit and engage with the issue. We've also set up 5 work streams, and we are making considerable progress. We've had our first farmer engagement meeting out in the fens, and over 30 farmers attended. It's absolutely appalling, nearly hurricane force winds, and it wasn't very comfortable. We still had a very good turnout. So it shows how seriously the farmers are taking this issue. We have a number of greenhouse gas measurement units called flux towers, and the farmers have actually committed to spend £104,000 on 2 new ones over the next 3 years. We have completed a pilot mapping exercise, and we've remapped 10,000 hectares of fenland in the county. We were hosted by Brian Evesham, Kate Carver and Lorna Parker with Ross Morrison of CEH, that's the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, at the Great Fen Project last week, looking at water table controls and polluter. And we have started the evaluation work on the economic and social impacts of the whole change that the area is possibly going to face. Now, this is actually turning into a huge task, and we've employed a full-time member of staff to run this. And she starts at the end of June when she completes her geography degree from Leicester University. Her dissertation was on peat, and she's predicted to get a first. The professor is Susan Page, who happens to be on the National Lowland Peat Task Force. So she's very well connected from that point of view. A lot of people are putting a lot of work into this, but we have to protect the core strategic food production capability for this nation. We also have to protect the jobs and social cohesion of an area that has seen a serious lack of investment for many years. And we also, of course, have to substantially reduce our CO2 emissions, as well as contributing to the doubling of nature commitment. I believe all these ambitions are actually complementary and achievable, but we have a major challenge ahead of us. So thank you, Richard.
No, well, thank you, John. I mean, I think it's great to have you not only leading that work on Penland Feet, Fenland Peat, forgive me, but also to have you as a strong advocate of the doubling nature vision, but I think also bringing that pragmatic view to it. And we're absolutely, or certainly me personally, absolutely, it's about how farmers and landowners work with the grain of this agenda and how we make it work for everybody. It's very, very multifaceted, but I, like you, believe that in actual fact there are shared pathways to prosperity through this agenda, that, you know, but it's making it happen on the ground and at speed. I think that's a huge challenge. Other questions for John then at this stage, or Adrian, before we go any further? You've got some nice comments in the chat to John, really inspirational, says Lorna. So that's always good to hear. If not, just conscious of time, save your questions, because there will be time and we can use the chat. But I believe Matthew has now joined us. If you have, Matthew, can you make yourself, there you are, bottom left. Hi, Matthew, nice to see you.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Not at all. And yeah, as I say, thank you for joining us at this stage. I think you're going to help us by talking about the role of the natural environment in economic decision making. We've got about 10 minutes, Matthew. I hope that's not too short, but it'd be great just to hear from you on that now. Thank you.
Yep, that's perfect. Let me just quickly share some slides. Can you confirm for me that you can see the slide?
We can, thank you.
Yes. And let me begin by offering my deepest apologies for a scheduling mistake entirely on my behalf.
Don't worry.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak. I know, looking through the list, I've met with a large number of the people on this call already through other similar engagements. So it's a great opportunity to be able to come and speak about the role of nature in economic decision making and in strategy, economic strategy, as we go forward. So I'm going to just go through a couple of slides to describe some of the things we've been thinking about at the Bennett Institute as part of our wealth economy project, which I've led since the project started alongside Diane Coyle at the Bennett Institute at the University of Cambridge. And if there's only a few things that you remember, I know you've been in a meeting all morning. If there are just a few things from my talk that I would like you to take away, please let it be these. First and foremost, the way we have thought about the economy over the past century, at least, has been backwards, right? The way we need to think about the economy for the next century is going to be forward-looking, looking to the future, understanding dynamics into the long run. And one of the most fundamental insights that this way of looking at the economy can deliver is that our entire economy, from the smallest subsistence farmers up to the biggest companies on the planet, exists and operates within the context and confines of nature and our biosphere. We can't escape what happens in nature any more than a smoker's lungs can escape the smoke. We're part of that same integrated system. We can't get out. And our economic models have not reflected that until now. When we start thinking in this wealth economy, inclusive wealth framework, we realize that we need to measure what matters. This is not a new mantra to deliver, but it is crucially important. And I'm going to come on to what specifically we ought to measure and at what scales, from the local to the national to the global, in order to deliver a green, resilient recovery that hits the topics that John was just speaking about: providing jobs, providing social cohesion, providing opportunities across our region. And we need to recognize that nature, properly maintained, can increase the returns to all other assets. A stable climate system increases the returns to your infrastructure. High quality ecosystems, resplendent with biodiversity, will increase the returns to our property investments, and so forth and so on. And the final thing is, we are in a unique situation. We cannot afford to waste our stimulus again. We did that after the great financial crisis. We missed the opportunity to deliver a green recovery. It was a lost decade, and we look where we are now. We simply cannot afford to do it again. And the basis, the intellectual basis, comes from another Cambridge economist, who I'm sure would have loved to be here were he to get the invitation today, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. He has provided the theoretical framework in which all of the rest of our work sits. And you may be familiar that this year he launched, the Dasgupta Review on the Economics of Biodiversity. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that you look for some of the events on YouTube in which he describes it. Now, Dasgupta is a brilliant economist, and if you were to read his papers, you would see 70 years, or 50 years at least, of calculus. I have tried to reduce that into one slide. And the fundamental insight that Dasgupta delivers for us is that the stock of ingredients in the pantry determines the size of the pie. And our economy operates just like a bakery. If you're running out of ingredients in the pantry, then tomorrow's pie is necessarily smaller. But for the economy, those core economic ingredients of prosperity, they're not just milk and eggs and butter, they are capital assets. And there are many. There's natural capital, which is those stocks of the environment that generate benefits for people. This is ecosystems, natural resources, it's our agricultural land and our stable climate system. There's human capital, which we normally refer to as the skills of the population and the size of the labor force, but crucially, it is also the health of the population and the labor force. There's physical capital, our physical infrastructure, which we're used to thinking of as capital, but there's also social capital, that level of trust that exists among people, among businesses, between people and the government and our institutions, which is crucial to economic activity. When we order something online, we send our financial information. That's sensitive data. and we trust that it will be used safely and responsibly. Without that, imagine how much smaller our economy might be if we couldn't trust those transactions. And so what matters is what's going on in the entire economic pantry. And when I say we need to measure what matters, I mean, instead of just focusing on the size of the pie, let's start measuring what's going on in our shared economic pantry. And this isn't just sort of waffly stuff that makes us feel good. It's not motherhood and apple pie. It's real hard-hitting economics. We can actually account for these assets. If we look just at the natural capital portfolio of the United Kingdom, we know that the asset value is at least £1 trillion, and we know that that is an underestimate. We know that this comes from the value of our fisheries, the value of our timber industry, the value of our agricultural land, air quality, outdoor recreational facilities. We know that £78 billion is added to the value of our housing stock just because those homes are close to green space. We know that there's a direct effect of air quality, natural capital, on health and productivity in the labor force. We know that urban trees provide cooling and shading services, which means we can avoid air conditioning and energy costs. And all of these have direct economic impacts, but they haven't until now been really reflected in economic accounts, and therefore they haven't been considered in economic decisions, particularly around strategy. But let's take a look more fundamentally at what's happening to the value derived from these underlying assets. Now, this is a busy slide with lots of different lines. I only want you to care about two colors, the green color and the red color. The green line represents the index of the value of services, the physical flow of services we've gotten from renewable energy since 2003 to 2018. Any investor would love a portfolio that looks like that. If instead we take a look indexed to 2003 at the red line, that's the flows we've had from fossil fuels, another component of natural capital. Right? It's dropped 60%. No investor wants to admit having that in their portfolio. Which would you want your pension to be invested in? Right? And this has a direct effect on how we start building strategies for managing the economy. Imagine you're sitting in the Treasury and you're relying on revenues from the fossil fuel sector, and you see that their provisioning services are collapsing over time. Then you know that your revenue source is unsustainable, and you're going to have to find some other way of making up your government revenue. I've mentioned that nature increases the returns to our other assets, but what does that mean specifically? Well, we know that nature provides loads of different services: air purification, soil stabilization, nutrient recycling. Right? We know that it provides a space for outdoor recreation. But we also know that all of our assets, all of the ingredients in the economic pantry interact with one another. And when we start thinking about this wealth economy framework, we start seeing the strategic complementarities that can exist between different asset classes. And when we understand those complementarities, we can start to think about a comprehensive investment strategy that maximizes them. We know that a just-in-time, super high-tech, ultra-modern supply chain is more efficient, more productive, more profitable if we don't have super floods and disruptive storms. We know that our transport infrastructure is more reliable if we don't have extreme heat waves. We know that even in rich countries, energy infrastructure can be susceptible to climate change. We've seen this in Texas this past year. And so all of our other assets in which we invest depend on nature as well. And as I've mentioned, we simply cannot afford to get this wrong again. Our fiscal conditions at the moment are right for environmental investment. Protecting nature is far cheaper far less costly than dealing with the consequences of a global pandemic or dealing with the consequences of climate change. And there is overwhelming public support to act boldly and act now. And that public support is research-based. It's found in myriad public opinion polls around the UK over time, around Europe over time, in the US, Australia. I know, I've looked. It's there. There is a clear mandate. But what we need to change in our politics is we need to shift from making commitments to meeting them. And we've not done that yet. So that's our challenge. And I think that's my time.
Well, you got both those things spot on, didn't you, Matthew? It's certainly our challenge. It's absolutely bang on time. So thank you for that. And thank you for the presentation. Can I ask whether Professor Dasgupta has approved the summary of his 600-page work into one slide featuring a cherry pie?
It's probably unfair. I genuinely, I do recommend reading the Dasgupta review. He has been a very strong supporter of the project that we're working on with Diane at the Bennett, though.
Lovely. Guys, what I'm going to do, thank you very much, Matthew. What I'm going to do is, because I'm just conscious of time, I'm going to invite Councillor Tierney to speak next on the basis that I think it's some kind of concept of family hold back, Helen. We can have our day in the sun another time, but Steve's a guest and we would love to hear from him. And then what I'm going to suggest is, for those who can, I'm happy to prolong the conversation for another 10 minutes if there are questions that we want to discuss. So the meeting will finish at 12, but if anyone wants to stay on for a maximum of 10 minutes for further questions, that's fine. And we'll try and fit in your piece, Helen, if we've got time. But I thought I'd like to make sure we've got time to hear from you, Councillor Tierney, from Fenland District Council. It's great to have you with us this morning, and just sort of some reflections from yourself and some remarks on what you've heard and also what's happening and going on in Fenland, which is a hugely important part of the Cambridgeshire jigsaw, and you know, one that we desperately want to engage more and active. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I've just got the dreaded your internet connection is unstable message just at the wrong moment. So can you all hear me clearly?
We can. At the moment, Steve, you're fine. We'll let you know.
Right, fingers crossed then. Okay, so first of all, I just want to say I have enjoyed the meeting, and I've enjoyed listening to the different projects and policies that are underway and clearly making a difference, and also in hearing the views about what direction we might need to take in the future. My comment earlier on the chat about political speech, it was born out of frustration more than disrespect, certainly no disrespect to Daniel. I simply feel that there's a danger that with partnerships like this, we can get stuck in point scoring between political persuasions. And it's just a personal view, but I don't think it's immensely helpful to building the sort of consensus we need and finding the areas we agree on in order to deliver on the aspirations we have. So while I welcome the opportunity to speak, I don't intend to get mired in party politics, but to try and focus on our similarities rather than our differences. So I think the important thing about a partnership like this, or any partnership really, is bringing together the different voices and views and finding areas where there's broad agreement. And they won't always necessarily be where you expect them to be, but until you find them, you can't build on them together. So there have been some things that people have talked about today that I don't entirely agree with personally. I'm not speaking on behalf of FDC, just a personal view, but we're all bringing our personal selves to these meetings. We're never going to agree on every issue or every policy or even every ideal outcome, but there seems to be a lot of common ground from what I've heard. And I'm looking forward to playing a part in the future discussions and the work wherever possible. So I'd like to thank all the speakers for their time and for sharing their views. The obvious passion, everyone who's spoken, it's been very clear that there's a lot of passion here, and I think that goes a long way to kind of giving us something to build on. So on behalf of Fenland District Council, we thank you for inviting me and us, if you like, me as the representative, and we look forward to being a part of this going forwards. And I hope you won't mind if I'm occasionally the only skeptic in the room, but I'll do my best to do it in a positive and helpful way. Thank you.
Thank you. No, absolutely. I think we need to make sure we're grounded at all times. I think we need to make sure that we are working, you know, with the grain as much as possible. I think we all have a role, don't we, both to be challenging, but to be positive is the key thing here. And I think the one thing about our agenda at Natural Cambridgeshire, where we are very biodiversity focused, is that you know, nature is everyone's friend. It's, you know, wherever you go, whether it's an urban back garden or, you know, even a shopping car park, you can find wonderful sights of nature. And we need to just remember that common purpose at all time. And also, I think, do remember, it was a question I was going to ask the RSPB, you know, sometimes we have to remind everybody that nature really is in crisis and we are in danger of losing so much of it. And that's what we're all about, really, is working together to address that fundamental fact. But thank you, Stephen. We do look forward to working with you. I think I've got a meeting coming up with one of your directors to talk about some practical ways in which we can move this agenda forward in Fenland. Great stuff. Okay, well, Helen, do you want to just sort of offer your piece then, please? I just want to say before everyone goes, John Shropshire, I don't know whether you can see the chat, but there's quite a few comments for you, all very positive, but you may want to pick some of those up at some stage, not now, but just sort of take a note of some of the things that are being suggested to you.
Yeah, will do.
We'll keep a copy of it, so we'll send it to you.
That'd be great, actually, if you could. Thank you.
Lovely, great stuff. Well, let's introduce Helen. Helen is the Natural Cambridgeshire coordinator, and Helen's just going to give us a little bit of an update on our priorities and what we're up to at the moment. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you. Yes, I will try and be brief and to the point. We've had a lot of input today and it's been lots and lots of food for thought, but this is just to sort of draw the threads together for Natural Cambridgeshire. Obviously, many of you will know Natural Cambridgeshire, but some of you may be new to this, as Councillor Tierney is as well. So I just thought a quick recap of the aims of the partnership and why we're here and what we're doing and how we hope to provide a framework to support some of this, these sort of pathways, if you like, going forwards. So yeah, Natural Cambridgeshire is the local nature partnership for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. We represent and work with environmental and community stakeholders across the county to speak up and out for nature to ensure that environmental considerations are at the heart of decision making, from policymakers, landowners, businesses and service providers down to grassroots communities up. And I think this is one of the key themes, isn't it, of today and the times we're in, is how we get that bottom up and top down right. And at Natural Cambridgeshire, what the trustees try to do, and the trustees are made up of a broad range of environmental stakeholders from across the county and make a real powerhouse. We're well connected into pretty much everything. How we can provide that framework work. Clearly there was the Doubling Nature launch in 2019, which had the support of the Combined Authority and all district authorities and many organisations, and that ambition is embedded, and we move forward and we look at how we can further progress that. So our delivery plan includes a focus on the 6 key landscapes, and that continues. So the Nyman Valley, the John Clare Countryside that you heard about today, the Fens for the Future, the Great Ouse Valley, the Cambridge Network and the West Cambridgeshire Hundreds. So these provide a sort of focus for us all, whether we're professional or even at a community level where we're all residents, are opportunities there to help to shape and deliver those. We've got a local nature recovery toolkit, and as we've discussed earlier throughout this, that developing and expanding that offer to communities, so we can offer a sort of framework for communities to link in, working with partner organisations at all levels. So that's one of the things we're looking at doing, is how we can provide that framework that has relevance at a very local level, and enables and supports communities through the offer of advice and grants, and networking and connection to take that forward. A key part of this, of course, is how on earth do we fund all of this? There are so many changes in the funding landscape, and one thing we're looking at is launching a fund for nature later in the year. So do look out for that. This is going to be a major initiative for the county and something that we hope we will all be working together on, and we'll let you know more about that in due course. And this is to sort of incentivise and underpin nature recovery across the county. Now, within that, we obviously need a strategic framework, and this is something that the landscapes and the various forums and working groups that Natural Cambridgeshire has. We have a strategic framework within which we are addressing and discussing and conversing with all stakeholders. So working very closely with the Combined Authority, working very closely with local authorities, with the Policy and Planning Forum, and we work alongside and with to influence the how do we achieve 20% biodiversity net gain? How do we work with the various local authorities. As you heard from Adrian, some are more advanced than others. So how is that panning out across the county, and how can we ensure that there's equity for nature across all districts within that? That's in a nutshell the sort of format for Natural Cambridgeshire, and where we're going forwards. What does that look like? You know, we've again touched on all of the themes here: developing systems and approaches, forging new partnerships. As you know, Richard said, there are shared pathways to prosperity, and how can we make those more at speed? And I think we need to turn this talking into the doing, and we have to ask ourselves at our individual levels, what is it that we can bring to the table to accelerate that in our professional lives, as well as being part of that community? What can we do at the grassroots to raise that awareness and to support local democracy on a very local scale, both for nature, so there's sort of natural justice as well as social justice within the mix. It's a really exciting time. It is very complex. Here at Natural Cambridgeshire, we're trying to facilitate those discussions to accelerate the speed with which we can move this forward, because as we've heard today, you know, we do need to push on. Great to be here with you today, and we look forward to working with you to establish a fund for nature and to look at developing that strategic framework with which we can deliver for nature across the county. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Helen, and thank you for all the great work you're doing. It's made such a difference to us having a coordinator, and thank you to our funders for helping make that happen. I would just emphasise those 2 points that Helen's raised there. The board met last week and has endorsed our decision to move as fast as we can to set up a fund for nature across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and we'll be coming to you for your support, not necessarily your money, but we will need to show that we are aligned behind the desirability of an overarching fund for nature. And I think too, we'd all agree that a strategic framework that allows for the environment in all its aspects to be led and to be delivered coherently across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough is also something to be desired. And again, we'll be talking to you in a lot more detail as we take our plans forward on that. Now, bizarrely, we've got to a stage where suddenly we've got 5 minutes to spare. I don't know how we've done that, but congratulations to all our speakers and for keeping to time, apart from one notable exception. We won't invite him back, I tell you. We've got 5 minutes ready for the questions. If anybody wants to raise anything or just make a comment on anything they've heard, or a question that you've put in the chat that hasn't been answered. Gosh, you're all very well behaved and quiet today. Tim Brightmire's got his hand up. Yes, please. Nice to see you, Tim. Tim's one of our trustees on Natural Cambridgeshire.
It might be just worth reflecting as we sit here today as to just how honourable our new American president's credentials are going to be, to see whether he makes the decision to reduce the mandate on biofuels, which will completely turn the grain markets upside down because of the American fossil fuel interests in the South, which is very likely to happen and which will inevitably be very, very damaging for the environment.
Okay, Tim, I must admit, I'm not cited on that, so send us a link to something on that. I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah, basically they're trying to decide in Congress whether they're going to reduce the mandate for biofuel inclusion, American transport fuel. Brazil have already done it, and America look as if they may follow suit, which doesn't send a very good message to the world.
No, not at all. That's a somber note. Thank you for that. Any other questions? If not, unless Councillor Hastings, you just unmuted yourself. Was that with intent? No. You got to be careful. I can see these things. Okay, guys, look, let's not go on too long then. Thank you, I think, very much to Peter for just a second. Anna's raised her hand.
Since there's a gap, I thought I'd just like to say that actually those talks that we've had this morning have been both inspiring and exciting, but also really quite daunting. And I think I'm so pleased that you've got such a good partnership. We, should I say, have such a good partnership in you to actually take this work forward, because, you know, just simply thinking about Fenland Peak, for example, is such a huge project, and you're working on evidence base, and I'm so pleased that you're gathering all the data, and I don't know whether you have been involved. We had a group at the county council, the Cuspy group,
Yes.
which was, yeah, because they have produced brilliant data about ways to gather the evidence about carbon and the way to decarbonize. So I don't know if there's any information there that might be useful to you, but I'm just so pleased that you're taking such a positive approach and really tackling these really difficult, complex, costly decisions in a very scientific way. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I think you're absolutely right to correct yourself. This is our partnership, and you're very much part of it, Anna, and everybody on this call. And I would encourage us all to see it that way. It's not the Natural Cambridgeshire partnership. It's all of us together working for the same ends in perhaps different ways. I wanted to thank Professor Peter Lanshoff, who put the agenda together today and works very diligently to get everybody lined up. And I think these sessions are remarkable in the quality of the speakers that Peter persuades or cajoles to join us, and the quality of the debate. And let's look forward to the next one, which will be in September, and which will be, you know, we'll be approaching then the Global Biodiversity Conference and COP26. We hope to be in a position to talk more about how we make our ambitions reality. I think, as we said at the beginning, it's an astonishing moment in time. It does feel very exciting, despite what Daniel said. I still feel that there is more in the policy agenda now than there ever has been in my lifetime that is pointing in the right direction. We have to deliver it. The crisis is real. And I suppose I would perhaps just take us back gently to where Justin and I started, that sometimes it is nice just to get, you know, focus on the very local, because things can happen there. You can, sometimes some of the big projects take years and years and years and millions of pounds, but actually if everybody is doing their bit, I know it's a cliche, it can make a difference, but above all, it can perhaps inspire us a bit to just keep going and try and help nature recover. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us. Thank you for all the illuminating questions in the chat. We'll do our best to kind of look at that and reflect on it. And it is bang on 12 o'clock. So how's that? Not bad. Well done, everybody. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Hey, right, let's just leave this.